The process, of course, has been more than 2 years in the making behind this white paper, and a lot of that work was done under the stewardship of the then Defence Minister, Kevin Andrews. He was, of course, replaced by Maurice Payne in the September leadership change and reshuffle, but Kevin Andrews joins me now. Thank you very much for your time this afternoon.
Pleasure, David.
Can I actually start with what this white paper said about the strategic challenges and threats that we face? And we're always going to be looking at what it says about China. We might bring up what it says. The quote is, Australia opposes the use of artificial structures in the South China Sea for military purposes, and Australia is particularly concerned by the unprecedented pace and scale of China's land reclamation activities. Particularly concerned. Is that the sort of language that you would have used?
Indeed. If you look at the activities of China in the last couple of months or so, then clearly China is acting very aggressively in what they see as their national interest. But is that in the interest of the peace of the region and the ability to trade? I would argue no. They have taken a situation which has largely been a vacuum in terms of deterrence, and they've expanded with these artificial reefs.
Given that, does the language in this white paper go hard enough?
Well, I think we have to go very hard, because President Xi Jinping said at the White House in Washington last September that China would not pursue the militarisation of these artificial reefs. Now, they had already militarised parts of those reefs at that stage with runways, with docking facilities, with major infrastructure. Yet we know that in the last few weeks they've now put missiles on Woody Island in the Paracel Islands, and that's in the South China Sea. In the East China Sea, there are reports that they have converted naval frigates, painted them as Coast Guard vessels, including having weapons on those vessels, and are using them in disputed waters, which is an escalation of the militarisation in the East China Sea as well.
Why isn't Australia saying China should stop these activities rather than saying we're concerned?
Well, I think we should be saying we stop it, because if you look at the South China Sea, the reality is that, first of all, some of these reefs are underwater. They don't substantiate a claim under international law, but even where they might, there are a number of countries all claiming sovereignty of these various outcrops and reefs and islands.
So should the white paper say that China should stop this?
Well, whether the white paper says it or not, what we should be saying clearly as Australia is that it should be stopped. We've seen the Admiral of the Pacific Fleet, Admiral Harris, come out and protest against what he called the Great Sand Wall of China. We've seen the Vice Admiral in charge of the 7th Fleet based in Japan call upon Australia to be more active in relation to deterrence against the Chinese. But if there's no deterrence, if China sees a vacuum from America in particular, just like I think President Putin does elsewhere in the world, then they will continue their aggressive activities.
What about this debate over whether Australia should conduct a freedom of navigation exercise through this disputed territory? What's your view on that?
Well, going back, we've been running what's called gateway patrols over the South China Sea for about 35 years, and they happen roughly every few weeks, once a month or so. We should continue that. Secondly, I believe that we should regularly sail our naval vessels through that area. They go on deployment to Japan, to even to China, and for visits to Vietnam.
But within the 12 nautical mile range?
There's no reason they shouldn't go through, and where it's quite clear that there is no proper claim, then we should conduct freedom of navigation exercises.
Within the 12 nautical mile zone,
definitely.
as the US have done?
Yes.
Because the Prime Minister's unwilling to, well, at least state whether we should or we shouldn't.
Well, my belief is that we should. As I said, geopolitics, like nature, abhors a vacuum. There's been a vacuum of deterrence from the United States and allies over a number of years now, and China has just become more assertive and aggressive in what they're doing. And for President Xi to say at the White House, when standing next to President Obama, that we're not going to pursue militarisation, yet we find within a few months they have continued to pursue militarisation, then I don't think we can close our eyes and be somewhat overly sanguine that there's nothing happening there. It quite clearly is.
I think the quote from you before you left the job as Defence Minister was that the white paper was substantially ready to go, ready to be announced. Are there any substantial differences in what you see today in terms of the funding that's been allocated and the equipment that's been listed?
No, David, and I'm pleased that the work which had started under my predecessor, Senator Johnson, and I continued a lot of it, and that involved, this wasn't about me, it was the Defence Department, it was an expert panel. It's not anybody in particular's white paper, it should be Australia's white paper, but I think roughly about 98% of what was there ready to go in September is reflected in the white paper.
It begs the question, what's the 2% then?
Oh, well, there's a change in the funding schedule because we're into a new financial year, so it goes a further financial year out. And there's some changes in language and tone around a number of subjects. There's changes a bit in emphasis here and there, but
including on the China question.
It's largely what was there in September, because the process was that we had written a chapter of the white paper approximately once a month for about a year, which went through the National Security Committee over that period of time. So that's why it was largely completed in September last year.
And when you look at the number of, or the list of threats and challenges that are listed there, whether it's tackling ISIS, whether it's cybersecurity, or the South China Sea, what is the top priority?
Look, there are a number. I think it's difficult to, give them an order of 1 to 5, but it's the diffusion of the Islamist terrorist threat into our region. It's this aggression that is coming from China, particularly in the China Sea. There's the renewed activities of Russia, including within our region, and there is, always a risk of a failed nation state in our region. Now that might not be particularly high, but it's always a risk which is there.
And then the submarine question, of course, is a big political issue as much as anything. There's a commitment today for 12 submarines, and you're indicating that that's a commitment you would have made as well.
Well, we were speaking about, and in the competitive evaluation process, of 8 to 12,
right.
And that's what I understand the bidders have acted upon. So you can scale up or down depending on whether you're looking at the cost of 8 or the cost of 12.
Okay, so 12's now been committed to. We still don't know that they necessarily will be built in Australia. What's your view on that? Is it now virtually guaranteed they will be?
No, the process should be followed through. If you look at the CEP, it asks for a bid on an overseas build, an onshore build and a hybrid. Now, the reason for that was in part to be able to determine what the premium might be if it's built in Australia completely, say, versus being built completely overseas. Yes, we want to maximise, and we said this, maximise Australian industry involvement, and we should do that, but there comes a point where, if it's going to cost twice as much to build in Australia as to build overseas, well then that would be very unprofitable. So there's got to be a balance to this, and that always has to be worked out in the assessment.
Can I just ask you about the dollar figure here? Because in the white paper today it says it's got a dollar figure of $50 billion being allocated just for the acquisition of the submarines, and I know some of the bidders have suggested they could do it a whole lot cheaper than that. Why do we need to allocate $50 billion just for the acquisition, let alone the sustainment costs over the life of the submarine, which would be a lot more than that?
Well, the final figure will be determined by what the bids are. And look, there's been a lot of jockeying, if I can put it that way, in the media by the various bidders as to how much they can do that. At the end of the day, that means nothing. What we have to concentrate on is the capability of the submarine to do the job we want it to do, otherwise it's useless. And secondly, then you can look at what the actual bid is when it comes in on the paper. But the international rule of thumb is that about 2/3 of the lifetime cost of a naval vessel is in the sustainment phase, and about 1/3 in the actual acquisition.
So all up, we could be looking at 150. Is it fair to say enough fat's been built into that $50 billion figure to accommodate it being built in Australia, even if that costs more?
Well, one would hope so. I've seen various claims by the various bidders, and as I said, I think we should take all that with a grain of salt, to use an old expression, because it's going to be what they actually put down and what's in the contract. And then beyond that, I noticed in the white paper that there's a reference to a review in the late 2020s. Now that's before the first submarine is even delivered on the schedule we're working on at the moment, so that will have to be a factor that's worked into the bid cost as well.
Kevin Andrews, thank you very much for joining us on this today.
Pleasure, David.